All right, so we are doing this first part of the origins of the Cold War. In some of the classes, we took some time to go over some review material before the exam. So if you feel like got through this in your class, you can kind of fast forward to wherever you need to be. And if you need to start at the beginning of this, uh, you certainly can. So I'm just going to kind of start from the beginning. We're going to make two parts of this. So this will be the first part. All right. So today we're talking about the origins of the Cold War. Like how does this ideological struggle that lasted from 1945 to, you could say, really 1991 between the United States and the Soviet Union after the two countries had been allies in World War II. So we need to kind of look at like where some of the sources of tension came from. All right. And you could go back as early as 1917, 1918, when the USSR becomes a country. You have the Bolshevik Revolution. They kick the Tsar Nicholas out, and the communists take over. And the United States did not recognize the Bolsheviks as the legitimate government. And the United States never even recognized the USSR as a legitimate existing state until the 1930s. And I think that upset the USSR a little bit. And you have to remember too that after World War I, there's a proliferation of communism in the first kind of Red Scare in the 1920s, and the American government, who's very wedded to the business community. The business community thinks that their greatest problems are from socialists and communists and labor unions. And that's why the American government kind of resisted recognizing the USSR. And for that matter, I'm going to kind of just put those two ideas together. So, delayed recognition of USSR, communism in America. These were early seeds of mistrust between the two. Okay, now to World War II. If you recall, during World War II, there had been a number of discussions between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And by the early 1940s, after the Allies had successfully taken North Africa, Churchill and Roosevelt met at Casablanca in North Africa, and Stalin wasn't invited to be at that meeting. Stalin had been pressing the Allies to open up a second front. Remember that after in the early 1940s, Hitler had violated his non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. And from that time on, literally we're talking about 41, 42, Stalin is begging the Allies to open up a second front to relieve the pressure that he's feeling from the invasion of the Germans. And the Allies kept saying, no, we're not ready. We cannot do that. And so this was also something that caused a certain amount of mistrust and bitterness in terms of Stalin towards first the Allies, but then in particular later on the United States. All right, now we kind of fast forward to the end of the war. So now we're kind of talking about 1945-ish and moving up, into the late 40s. And what we saw really as 1945 progresses, and it appears very much so like the Germans are going to lose World War II, the Soviet Union starts taking over what we now kind of call satellite states. And so areas in between Germany and Russia that the Russians would install what amounts to puppet regimes, puppet governments. And what that means is that they had a government and they had leadership, but those weren't the real leaders. The real power was back in Moscow and Russia. Those governments were taking their orders from people in the Soviet government back in Moscow. And so we see this in places like Latvia and Estonia and Moldova and Belarus and Ukraine and all these places that come under the domination of the Soviet Union. And it's very clear that something has to be done about Poland. You remember, this is the original country that gets invaded that starts World War II. And now the Soviets look like they're going to install a government that's going to be pro-Soviet, even though if they were to hold democratic elections, that government at the time probably would have lost. But Stalin also knows that the United States and the British are done basically with the war, that they would not go to a secondary war to try to free Poland this time. And so what, at Yalta, and we'll talk about Yalta in just a minute, but really Stalin just takes over Eastern Europe. And this is going to be something that we're upset about, but we're not really willing to do anything to directly challenge it. Okay, but probably the biggest difference between the two that caused the biggest seed of mistrust is just a great big gigantic ideological difference between the two countries. So we'll just highlight two in particular. One would be economic systems. The United States was pro-business, pro-capitalism, individual choice of business, trade with every country that you possibly could. Whereas the Soviet Union, they have this command economy where the government decides what should be produced and how much should be produced. And if it's run well, it's very stable. There's not a lot of growth, but there's very little chance of decline. It's not as erratic as capitalism. So, that idea of kind of, if you remember in AP Human Geography, the idea of self-sufficiency. We don't need the outside world. Therefore, we're not going to really trade with the outside world. We're not going to buy their goods, and we're not going to sell extra goods to sell in that world market. And that goes contradictory to what we are trying to accomplish. We want to try to trade with everyone. So that's the first ideological difference. The second one really is this idea of our government's better than your government. Our style of government's better than your style of government. Whereas we are touting individual freedom, democratic processes, Bill of Rights protects the individual, the rights of the individual. There's very little things standing in your way in terms of opportunity, even though I think a lot of us probably understand that in reality that's not true. But that's kind of the vision that we promoted. Whereas the Soviet Union, it wasn't about the individual. And I think that's the main thing. It was about the country, the state, right? What can you do for Mother Russia, or what can you do for the Soviet Republic? It's not about what's important for you; it's how you can contribute. And so, like, if you had a job, you weren't really working for payment for you; you were working to produce something for the state. And that's just a world of ideological difference between the two systems. Okay, so that's a big part of this. That's a big part of this lecture, is understanding why we went from allies in 1945 to enemies for the next, really, I guess, 40 years, 40 plus years. All right, we talked about Yalta. So Yalta is really the last major international conference that FDR would be a part of, as he's gonna die in early April. And so February 45 is just a couple months before his death. Yalta is actually in Russia. It's a kind of there's not many beachside cities or places in Russia, but Yalta would be one of them. It's kind of a resort town in the Crimean Peninsula. And so, they met in the dead of the winter, so it's not exactly warm at that time. But you have Churchill, you can see there. You have FDR in the middle, and then you have Stalin on the right. Now, there's a couple of I guess you'd say three kind of major things that are hammered out at Yalta. And the first one is that at the time we were engaged in this just dragged out, knockdown battle with the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Theater. And at the time, we wanted the Soviet Union to come in to help, kind of like they wanted us to do in the Western Theater. And it was at Yalta that the Soviet Union said that they would agree to do that. The second thing that happens at Yalta is we begin to see kind of the design occupations for Germany. We understand now that the Soviet Union had a much different vision for Germany than the Allies did. The Allies wanted to rebuild Germany. They knew Germany was going to be in shambles after the war, and they certainly were. They wanted to rebuild Germany. They wanted to not make the same mistake of punishing them with reparations like they did at the end of World War I. They wanted to create an ally instead of an enemy. They wanted to rebuild Germany. Stalin was not interested in that at all. He wanted to break Germany down. He wanted to make Germany agrarian. He wanted them to not have industry, to not have military, and basically they wanted to take over the eastern part of Germany, and that's pretty much what they ended up doing. This is where we kind of start to see that formulation of the division of Germany. And then the last one would be, free elections. Now, I just told you in the previous slide that these things didn't happen. At the time in 45, there was this kind of vision that, hey, these places would get free elections. Stalin promised for Poland that they would have free elections, and that did happen, but not for 40 years. Really, I think that kind of when we talk about the betrayal at Yalta, the World War I started because in the invasion of Poland, and ironically enough, it was one of the Allies who ended up taking it over and then not giving it up for a long time. Okay, next concept in the Cold War thing was kind of trying to keep the world peace. Towards the, I guess you could say it starts as early as 1940. Where we have the Atlantic Charter. Roosevelt and FDR are meeting off in Newfoundland and Canada, and they're coming up with this idea for an international peacekeeping organization. And by 1945, this comes to fruition in the shape of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations today is made up of virtually every country in the world. Every country at least has kind of a voice in terms of international agreements and things like that. And that was really the vision they started. Now, two important things that were created in terms of trying to help countries rebuild, trying to help countries economically develop, are things that are important today, and that's the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the creation of the World Bank. The World Bank typically gives out loans to LDCs or underdeveloped countries to help them economically generate wealth, and then you pay that money back to the World Bank. And the goal of this was to stabilize world currencies, to make sure that countries could economically develop, and really just to kind of get the world to work together and to trade together. But you got to understand that this is a very capitalist idea, and even though the Soviet Union was part of the United Nations, really they didn't share the vision that most of the Western powers did in the creation of that. Okay. But nevertheless, the United Nations was created. It's headquartered in New York. There's kind of two important groups that I think you should probably know about. The General Assembly is really the representative body of all countries. And then the Security Council, I guess you could say, is the representative body of the most important countries. These are the countries that kind of carry the most weight. And initially, that was like the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. And they held a veto power. So if one of them didn't agree, then they all didn't agree. And, so it's kind of an interesting dynamic, especially early on or during the Cold War. Okay. By the late 1940s, we start to see things crystallize in Germany, and we begin to see this division of Germany. And so I want you to kind of just take a look at the picture on the right, and you can kind of see how Germany gets divided up. So you have really four sectors, I guess we could say. We have a British sector, we have a French sector, we have a United States sector, and then we have a Soviet Union sector. Now, the problem with the Soviet Union sector was that the biggest and most major city of Germany is Berlin, and that was deep within the German zone. Now, initially, there was what was called an access corridor, like basically a highway that you could use to get to West Germany and to East Germany. And so what happened is that the Western part, they kind of coalesced. And so they united under one government, the Federal Republic of Germany, and then East government, which was propped up by basically a communist Soviet-controlled government, the German Democratic Republic. But the real issue became Berlin. And in 1948, I almost said Hitler, but Stalin, he tried to press his luck, and he figured that if he just applied a little bit of pressure to Berlin, that he could just get the Western powers to give up. They would concede Berlin, and then Berlin would be Stalin's in Germany. So we're going to get back to that idea here in just a little bit. Okay, but what the Soviet Union did, and you can see it here, is that they created this kind of buffer area. You have everything from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and then you have the Western countries who were effectively capitalist. And, those countries were out of reach to us from really the late 1940s to the early 1990s in terms of trade, in terms of political interactions. I mean, we really didn't know what was going on in those countries because the Soviet Union kind of guarded them, protected them, kind of kept them behind closed doors, so to speak. And Winston Churchill is really the person that coined the term the Iron Curtain. He said in a speech that, from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has been cast down over Eastern Europe. And what he meant was these countries are kind of gone in a way. They're not trade partners anymore. They're not part of the world economy. They're not part of the world's political economy, or I'm sorry, political organization. They really were just kind of under Soviet control and behind this supposed Iron Curtain, even though I hope you understand there was really no actual Iron Curtain. It's a metaphor. All right. Now, we're going to talk about the creation of NATO, but you can see it kind of clearly on this map. The countries of the Western Europe are going to coalesce into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military alliance that if one of the countries gets attacked, that all of them would go to their defense. And in response to this, in the early 1950s, the Soviet Union coalesces all the Eastern European countries into what's called the Warsaw Pact. And for the most part, in Europe during the Cold War, this creates a balance of power. And so that if there are skirmishes, they're typically local ones. So like Czechoslovakia had a little civil war, Austria, Hungary has a little civil war in the 50s, and those things are kept local. This balance of power made the prospect of war so horrendous that it kind of kept them from fighting. And really, it was more of an ideological battle than anything else. All right, so what to do with the thorny problem of Berlin? Berlin was kind of like a dying vine, grape on a vine. It needed nutrients. It needed to be supplied. And really, we're talking about West Berlin here more than anything. And so Truman and the Allies, they had a decision to make. Were they going to just let Stalin cut off access to the access corridor to Berlin? By early 1948, Stalin wasn't allowing any of the Allies to come in. And so at first the idea was, well, let's use the militaries of our three countries and let's go in there and open it back up. And they came up with an idea that I think was probably pretty smart. And that was, well, let's just supply the city of West Berlin with, things that they needed. So food, medical supplies, and other supplies. And what we're going to do is we're basically just going to take them in on empty bombers. Like there's going to be no weapons on them. We're just going to take them in really big planes. Then we're going to drop the stuff off in these big crates and carts, and then we're going to get back up and we're going to go. And as long as we don't drop any bombs or anything like that, we're not the bad guy. We're bringing in humanitarian supplies. And so this is kind of a risk. This was a gamble. Those planes could have easily been shot down, and it would have probably led to war. But we kind of gambled on the idea that the Soviet Union wouldn't do this, that they didn't want to be seen by the world as the aggressor. And they didn't. They didn't shoot down any of the planes. And so for, the better part of, a year and a half, this is what we see. We see these nonstop shipments from the United States sector, the French sector, and the British sector, bringing these things in. And finally, Stalin just kind of gave up and reopened the access corridor. So this is kind of seen as a diplomatic victory for the United States. It kind of makes us look good, internationally, because we were trying to do a good thing, and we did it without starting a war. All right, so let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about strategy of foreign policy during the 1940s and 1950s, and really, for the most part, this kind of continue on throughout the Cold War in some way, shape, or form. It changes somewhat, but really, it's kind of the same idea, and that's what's called the containment doctrine. So you see there a guy that becomes the Secretary of State. His name is George Kennan. And he is really the guy that formulated the idea of, hey, we don't have to go into Poland, or we don't have to go into some of these other places that the Soviets have taken over and fight them directly to get rid of that control. But what we do need to do is we need to go to these places that are right outside the sphere of their influence. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So like Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey, after World War II, their economies were really bad and communism was gaining a foothold. And so Kennan said, we need to identify these places and we need to be kind of flexible in how we deal with them, but we need to prop them up. And in doing so, that's going to contain the spread of communism from where it is to where it could go. And that way we maintain our trading partners. They can buy goods from us. We can buy goods from them. And so that's kind of the containment doctrine. And what we're going to see is that Truman, in his years in office, is going to more or less, it won't be exactly like how George Kennan designed it to be, but really when we talk about containment or the Truman doctrine, it's really all the kind of the same thing. We're going to do what we can to give economic aid, military help indirectly, typically, to prop up these existing governments that are pro-Western, that are pro-democratic, that are at least pro-capitalist trading with us. And we're going to help them to resist the spread of communism to their country. Okay, and so that's really the big thing. Containment doctrine is going to stop the spread of communism. Remember, we talked about the creation of NATO to do this. We're going to see the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. So, the uranium atomic bomb, and then we have the hydrogen bomb. These are things that we had developed in the use of forceful negotiations with the Soviet Union. Right? Now, one of the big developments that we have that I think you probably should write down is NSC 68. And NSC 68 is really the first major kind of change or shift in peacetime military spending. This really commits us to a lot of deficit spending in terms of building up our military. Remember, up until this point, with occasional, buildups during the Spanish-American War and World War I, really for the most part of our country's history, we've been the exact opposite. We hadn't been building our military up at all, and really the only time we've done it is during war. So this is a huge shift and a big change in the direction of our military. We are going to become, like we are today, the biggest spender on the military and military goods in the world. We are going to be the biggest provider of military arms in the world. So this is kind of the beginning of that, but this is where we become kind of a military state. And you're going to see this continue, throughout most of the Cold War, and then, continue on until today. Another thing that you might want to get down is, and I probably talk about it a little bit later, but the National Security Act. So in 1947, Congress passes this Reorganization Act of the military, and that creates a permanent Joint Chiefs of Staff that organizes military activities. And then it also creates the Department of Defense. And you guys might know the Department of Defense is like the Pentagon, the big building that's in Washington, D.C. In fact, I think it's the largest building in the entire world. But the Department of Defense is going to coordinate, defensive efforts and make sure that the United States does not get invaded. This is something that, quite honestly, before Pearl Harbor, we probably really didn't need. And now it becomes one of our most important cabinet ministries that we have in the United States. It is also with the National Security Act that we develop things like the NSA, the CIA is developed through this. And really those two groups, the NSA, which collects information kind of domestically, and then also the CIA, which does it foreign. So they're foreign agency in terms of collection of information and intelligence. Those things are created in the late 1940s as a response to, the spread of communism. All right. So again, National Security Act creates the Department of Defense, National Security Council, also the NSA, and the National Security Agency and the CIA. All right. last thing, the Marshall Plan. And actually, you know what? I'm going to cut it off right there. So I will start the second lecture with the Marshall Plan. So we will end today with containment doctrine, and then we will start our next lecture with the Marshall Plan. All right. Thank you for tuning in.